George Washington is my fourth cousin 7 times removed. The Washington family was a wealthy Virginia planter family that had made its fortune through land speculation and the cultivation of tobacco. Washington's great-grandfather John Washington immigrated in 1656 from Soulgrave, Northamptonshire, England, to the English colony of Virginia, where he accumulated 5,000 acres of land, including Little Huntington Creek on the Potomac River. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, at Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, in the British colony of Virginia. He was the first of 6 children of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. His father was a justice of the peace and prominent public figure who had 4 additional children from his first marriage to Jane Butler. The family moved to Little Huntington Creek in 1735. In 1738, they moved to Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg, Virginia, on the Rappahannock River. When Augustine died in 1743, Washington inherited Ferry Farm and 10 slaves. His older half-brother Lawrence inherited Little Huntington Creek and renamed it Mount Vernon. Washington did not have the formal education his elder brothers received at Appleby Grammar School in England, but he did attend the Lower Church School in Hartfield. He learned mathematics, trigonometry, and land surveying and became a talented draftsman and map maker. By early adulthood, he was writing with considerable force and precision. In his pursuit of admiration, status, and power, his writings displayed little wit or humor. As a teenager, Washington ranked and compiled over 100 rules of social interaction styled Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. He had access to an English translation of a French book of manners. Washington often visited Mount Vernon and Bolivar, the plantation that belonged to William Fairfax, Lawrence's father-in-law. Fairfax became Washington's patron and surrogate father, and Washington spent a month in 1748 with a team of surveying Fairfax's Shenandoah Valley property. The following year, he received a surveyor's license from the College of William and Mary when he was 17 years old. Even though Washington had not served the customary apprenticeship, Fairfax appointed him surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia, and he appeared in Culpeper County to take his oath of office on July 20th, 1749. He subsequently familiarized himself with the frontier region, and though he resigned from the job in 1750, he continued to do surveys west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. By 1752, he had bought almost 1,500 acres in the valley and owned 2,315 acres. In 1751, Washington made his only trip abroad when he accompanied Lawrence to Barbados, hoping the climate would cure his brother's tuberculosis. Washington contracted smallpox during that trip, which immunized him and left his face slightly scarred. Lawrence died in 1752, and Washington leased Mount Vernon from his widow Anne. He inherited outright after her death in 1761. Washington was somewhat reserved in personality, but he generally had a strong presence among others. He made speeches and announcements when required, but he was not a noted orator or debater. He was taller than most. Accounts of his height vary from 6 foot to 6'3.5". He weighed between 210 and 220 pounds as an adult, and he was known for his great strength. He had gray-blue eyes and long reddish-brown hair. He did not wear a powdered wig. Instead, he wore his hair curled, powdered, and tied in a queue in the fashion of the day. Washington frequently suffered from severe tooth decay and ultimately lost all his teeth but one. He had several sets of false teeth which he wore during his presidency. Contrary to common lore, these were not made of wood, but of metal, ivory, bone, animal teeth, and human teeth possibly obtained from slaves. These dental problems left him in constant pain, which he treated with laudanum. As a public figure, he relied on the strict confidence of his dentist. Washington was a talented equestrian early in life. He collected thoroughbreds at Mount Vernon, and his two favorite horses were Blueskin and Nelson. Fellow Virginian Thomas Jefferson said Washington was the best horseman of his age and the most graceful figure that could be seen on horseback. He also hunted foxes, deer, ducks, and other game. He was an excellent dancer and frequently attended the theater. He drank alcohol in moderation but was morally opposed to excessive drinking, smoking tobacco, gambling, and profanity. Washington was descended from Anglican minister Lawrence Washington, who was his great-great-grandfather and whose troubles with the Church of England may have prompted his heirs to immigrate to America. Washington was baptized as an infant in April 1732 and became a devoted member of the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church. He served more than 20 years as a vestryman and church warden at Fairfax Parish and Truco Parish in Virginia. He privately prayed and read the Bible daily, and he publicly encouraged people and the nation to pray. He may have taken communion on a regular basis prior to the Revolutionary War, but he did not do so following the war and was admonished by Pastor James Abercrombie for failing to do so. Washington believed in a wise, inscrutable, and irresistible Creator God who was active in the universe, contrary to deistic thought. He referred to God in Enlightenment terms, including providence, the Creator or the Almighty, and the divine author or supreme being. He believed in a divine power who watched over battlefields, was involved in the outcome of war, was protecting his life and was involved in American politics and specifically the creation of the United States. Modern historian Ron Chernow has argued that Washington avoided evangelistic Christianity or hellfire and brimstone speech, along with communion and anything inclined to flaunt his religiosity. Chernow has said Washington never used his religion as a device for partisan purposes or in official undertakings. No mention of Jesus Christ appears in his private correspondence, and such references are rare in his public writings. However, Washington frequently quoted from the Bible or paraphrased it, and often referred to the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. There is debate on whether he is best classified as a Christian or a theistic rationalist, or both. Freemasonry was a widely accepted institution in the late 18th century, known for advocating moral teaching. Washington was attracted to the Masons' dedication to the Enlightenment principles of rationality, reason, and brotherhood. American Masonic lodges did not share the anti-clerical perspective of the controversial European lodges. A Masonic lodge was established in Fredericksburg, Virginia in September 1752, and Washington was initiated 2 months later at the age of 20 as one of its first entered apprentices. Within a year, he progressed through its ranks to become a Master Mason. Washington had high regard for the Masonic order, but his personal lodge attendance was sporadic. In 1777, a convention of Virginia lodges asked him to be the Grand Master of the newly established Grand Lodge of Virginia, but he declined due to his commitments leading the Continental Army. After 1782, he frequently corresponded with Masonic lodges and members, and he was listed as Master in the Virginia Charter of Alexandria Lodge No. 22 in 1788. Washington owned and rented enslaved African Americans, and during his lifetime over 577 slaves lived and worked at Mount Vernon. He acquired them through inheritance, gaining control of 84 dower slaves upon his marriage to Martha, and purchased at least 71 slaves between 1752 and 1773. From 1786, he rented slaves. At the time of his death, he was renting 41. His early views on slavery were no different from any Virginia planter of the time. From the 1760s onwards, his attitude towards the institution underwent a slow evaluation. The military career of George Washington spanned over 40 years of service, 1752 to 1799. Washington's service can be broken into three periods: French and Indian War, American Revolutionary War, and the Quasi War with France, with service in 3 different armed forces. British Provincial Militia, the Continental Army, and the United States Army. Because of Washington's importance in the early history of the United States of America, he was granted a posthumous promotion to General of the Armies of the United States, legislatively defined to be the highest possible rank in the U.S. Army more than 175 years after his death. Washington proved to be a better general than military strategist. His strength lay not in his genius on the battlefield, but in his ability to keep the struggling colonial army together. His troops were poorly trained and lacked food, ammunition, and other supplies. Soldiers sometimes even went without shoes in winter. However, Washington was able to give them direction and motivation. His leadership during the winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge was a testament to his power to inspire his men to keep going. By the late 1760s, Washington had experienced firsthand the effects of rising taxes imposed on American colonists by the British, and came to believe that it was in the best interest of the colonists to declare independence from England. Washington served as a delegate to the First Continental Congress in 1774 in Philadelphia. By the time the Second Continental Congress convened a year later, the American Revolution had begun in earnest, and Washington was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Over the course of the grueling 8-year war, the colonial forces won few battles, but consistently held their own against the British. In October 1781, with the aid of the French, who allied themselves with the colonists over their rivals, the British, the Continental forces were able to capture British troops under General Charles Cornwallis, 1738-1805, in the Battle of Yorktown. This action effectively ended the Revolutionary War, and Washington was declared a national hero. On January 6, 1759, Washington, at age 26, married Martha Dandridge Curtis, the 27-year-old widow of wealthy plantation owner Daniel Parke Custis. The marriage took place at Martha's estate. She was intelligent, gracious, and experienced in managing a planter's estate, and the couple created a happy marriage. They moved to Mount Vernon near Alexandria, where he took up life as a planter of tobacco and wheat and emerged as a political figure. Washington's 1751 bout with smallpox is thought to have rendered him sterile, though it is equally likely that Martha may have sustained injury during the birth of Patsy, her final child, making additional births impossible. The couple lamented not having any children together. Despite this, however, they went on to raise John Parke Custis and Martha Parke Custis, Martha's children from her previous marriage, and later Jackie's 2 youngest children, Eleanor Parke Custis and George Washington Parke Custis. The marriage also gave Washington control over Martha's one-third dower interest in the 18,000-acre Custis estate, and he managed the remaining two-thirds of Martha's children. The estate also included 84 slaves. As he rose old, he became one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, which increased his social standing. Washington was inaugurated on April 30th, 1789, taking the oath of office at Federal Hall in New York City. His coach was led by militia and a marching band, and followed by statesmen and foreign dignitaries in an inaugural parade with a crowd of 10,000. Chancellor Robert R. Livingston administered the oath using a Bible provided by the Masons, after which the militia fired a 13-gun salute. Washington read a speech in the Senate chamber asking that Almighty Being, who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, consecrate the liberties and the happiness of the people of the United States. Though he wished to serve without a salary, Congress insisted adamantly that he accept it, later providing Washington $25,000 per year to defray costs of the presidency, equivalent to $6.14 million in 2022. Washington wrote to James Madison, As the first of everything in our situation will serve to establish a president, it is devoutly wished on by part that these presidents be fixed on true principles. To that end, he preferred the title Mr. President over more majestic names proposed by the Senate, including His Excellency and His Highness the President. His executive presidents included the inaugural address, messages to Congress, and the cabinet form of the executive branch. Washington planned to resign after his first term, but the political strife in the nation convinced him he should remain in office. He was an able administrator and judge of talent and character, and he regularly talked with department heads to get their advice. He tolerated opposing views, despite fears that a democratic system would lead to political violence, and he conducted a smooth transition of power to his successor. On December 12, 1799, Washington inspected his farms on horseback. He returned home late and had guests over for dinner. He had a sore throat the next day, but was well enough to mark trees for cutting. That evening, Washington complained of chest congestion, but was still cheerful. On Saturday, however, he awoke to an inflamed throat and difficulty breathing and ordered Estate Overseer George Rawlins to remove nearly a pint of his blood. Bloodletting was a common practice of the time. His family summoned doctors James Craik, Gustavus, Richard Brown, and Elijah C. Dick. A fourth doctor, William Thornton, arrived some hours after Washington died. Brown initially believed Washington had quinsy. Dick thought the condition was a more serious, violent inflammation of the throat. They continued the process of bloodletting to approximately 5 pints. But Washington's condition deteriorated further. Dick proposed a tracheotomy, but the other physicians were not familiar with the procedure and therefore disapproved. Washington instructed Brown and Dick to leave the room while he assured Craik, "Doctor, I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." Washington's death came more swiftly than expected. On his deathbed, out of fear of being entombed alive, he instructed his private secretary, Tobias Lear, to wait 3 days before its burial. According to Lear, Washington died between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. on December 14, 1799, with Martha seated at the foot of his bed. His last words were, "'Tis well." From his conversation with Lear about his burial, he was 67. Congress immediately adjourned for the day upon news of Washington's death, and the Speaker's chair was shrouded in black the next morning. The funeral was held 4 days after his death on December 18, 1799 at Mount Vernon, where his body was interred. Cavalry and foot soldiers led the procession, and 6 colonels served as the pallbearers. The Mount Vernon funeral service was restricted mostly to family and friends. On July 9, 1799, Washington finished making his last will. The longest provision concerned slavery. All his slaves were to be freed after the death of his wife, Martha. Washington said he did not free them immediately because his slaves were intermarried with his wife's dower slaves. He forbade their sale or transportation out of Virginia. His will provided that old and young freed people be taken care of indefinitely. Younger ones were to be taught to read and write and placed in suitable occupations. Washington freed more than 160 slaves, including about 25 he had acquired from his wife's brothers, Bartholomew Dandridge, his wife's brother, Bartholomew Dandridge, in payment of a debt. He was among the few large slave-holding Virginians during the Revolutionary era who emancipated their slaves. On January 1, 1801, 1 year after George Washington's death, Martha Washington signed an order to free his slaves. Many of them, having never strayed far from Mount Vernon, were naturally reluctant to try their luck elsewhere. Others refused to abandon spouses or children still held as dower slaves, and also stayed with or near Martha. Following George Washington's instructions in his will, funds were used to feed, clothe the young, aged, and infirm slaves until the early 1830s. When Martha developed a fever in 1802, she burned all of her husband's letters to her, summoned a clergyman to administer the last communion, and chose her funeral dress. 2.5 years after the death of her husband, Martha died on May 22nd, 1802, at the age of 70. Washington was buried in the old Washington family vaults at Mount Vernon, situated on a grassy slope overspread with willow, juniper, and cypress and chestnut trees. It contained the remains of his brother Lawrence and other family members. But the decrepit brick vault needed repair, prompting Washington to leave instructions in his will for the construction of a new vault. Washington's estate at the time of his death was worth an estimated $780,000 in 1799, equivalent to $13.72 million in 2022. Washington's peak net worth was $587 million, including his 300 slaves. Wow. Washington held title to more than 65,000 acres of land in 37 different locations. The slaves of Martha Washington were property of the Custis estate. They could not legally be freed or sold, and were inherited by the Custis heirs upon Martha's death. Martha was furious when her personal maid, Anna Judge, escaped to New Hampshire, viewing the act as a betrayal. In her 1802 will, Martha bequeathed the only slave she owned directly, a man named Elish, to her grandson, choosing not to follow in her husband's example by freeing her enslaved property.